Welcome to the Church Podcast, where we're talking all things ministry so you can do church better. I'm your host, Christopher Wesley, and so glad that you are joining us again for another great episode. This week's guest is a good friend of mine, Annie Grandell. She works for YDisciple as their executive director, and YDisciple is a part of NET Ministries. Maybe you've heard about them before, but they offer missionaries all over the place, and we're going to jump into that in our interview. But during our conversation, Annie touches upon a bunch of different things, especially when it comes to the world of small groups. So if you've ever wanted to learn about small groups, this is the conversation for you. She unpacks the challenges and triumphs of moving from a centralized ministry, especially with young people, to a small group ministry. And the challenges include how to recruit volunteers, how to train those small group leaders. And we'll also dive into the critical need for training and overcoming some of the obstacles that do come when it comes to small group leading. We're also going to talk about some of the bright spots in youth ministry today, especially envisioning a future of discipleship making that evolves in a response to the changing culture around us. So it doesn't matter if you're experienced or this is something new to you. If you want to learn more about small group ministry, and if you just want to learn more about a great person like Annie, then check out this episode.
Okay.
Annie Grandell, welcome to the Church Podcast. I'm so pumped to have you on the show. Thank you so much for saying yes.
I am so excited to be here, in part because you and I end up having great conversations about ministry like all the time, and now we get to record one of them. So that's fun.
Yeah.
I can go back to all the good things you say and like revisit them now.
Well, this one's not only documented, but it's going to be shared with a bunch of people. So we really got to watch our words. But again, so glad that you could be with us. And for people who aren't familiar with who you are, can you share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Annie Grandell. I'm the YDisciple Director for NET Ministries. I've been with NET for the last 5 years, but with YDisciple for 7. 2 years before this, I was at the Augustine Institute working with YDisciple. It's a great joy to be a part of this particular mission here at NET. But also, I was a youth minister myself for about a dozen years in the same parish cluster in the eastern suburbs of St. Paul, Minnesota. And so now my job gets to be supporting and empowering youth ministers like me a very long time ago. So it's just the best part of my job is working with ministry leaders around the world. But more important than that, than all of that, I'm a wife and a mom. My husband and I have been married for almost 11 years, and we have 4 kids that keep me honest. I'll tell you that, and on my toes.
No, that's awesome. And we'll definitely dig into a little bit of the family life, work-life balance and everything.
Ooh,
but
fun.
I probably one of the reasons why we connected is you got your start in youth ministry. And, you know, us youth ministers, we like to stay connected. Share with us a little bit of your journey, how, like, you went from youth ministry and now you're the director of YDisciple, one of these large, you know, content-based companies in the country. Yeah.
It's funny. I was first introduced to YDisciple by Jim Beckman, our founding architect. So I get like 0 credit for the idea of YDisciple. I just stand on the shoulders of giants. So Jim Beckman, founding architect of YDisciple, came up with this idea. He didn't come up with the idea of small group discipleship, but he really, really brought it into the Catholic space in a way that nobody had. And I sat through one of his earliest trainings. It was 2011, and I took an absurd amount of notes. I have moved that file from probably 4 different computers, and it's always stayed on my on my desktop. And I sat there and listened to him talk about the need for small group discipleship in Catholic youth ministry. And I thought, at the same time, 2 things. 1, this is amazing. This is revolutionary. And this will never work. And so I think about that moment frequently as I sit in my desk now, because I'm now the YDisciple Director telling people, no, guys, it actually works. But it was in my own ministry. It was starting to implement it into my own ministry. And when I first heard him talk about it, my thought was, I couldn't figure out how I was going to get that to fit in the system that I had created in my parishes. It was like square peg round hole situation.
So let me interrupt you there.
Yeah.
Like, why was it such a square peg round hole sort of situation? Why didn't you think this was gonna fly?
I was hired the way most youth ministers are hired. Fresh out of college, doe-eyed, ready to save the world, kind of forgetting that the world already has a savior, and tasked with creating the big youth group. Our parish had about 800 students on the books, and so that was my job. And so I spent years putting effort into building this large group ministry, which was good and a beautiful thing. I'm never going to be the person who knocks those things. But he was talking about this more decentralized approach, where I needed to be empowering more people, not just to be on my team and do my bidding, but to become co-youth ministers in a sense. And if I'm really honest with myself, the reason I thought it wouldn't work was because I didn't want it to. I liked being in the center. I was good at being in the center. It was my ministry. And there was a lot of unhealthy things about that. And so I heard this idea of decentralizing youth ministry, and empowering more people in the parish to be more than just on my core team helping me run this weekly event, but to multiply myself, was intimidating. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as soon as you said that, I had flashbacks to large group ministry that I've like overseen, and
Hmm.
it is like a drug, right? You're like
Yeah.
on a stage, and you've got every young person's attention. You're making them laugh, you're making them think.
Yep.
You've got the cool PowerPoint going on. If you've got like a screen, or you've got the gimmick,
Yep.
um, and so it is tough to make that transition from centralized on you to
Hmm.
decentralized to other catechists, small group leaders, volunteers, however you want to look at it. But I want to go back because something you mentioned was your parish hired you. You were young, you were energetic, you were
Hmm.
out there, and
Yep.
that seems to be something that you know I feel like I've heard a lot of people talk. I don't want to say necessarily negative, but skeptical about that.
Mm.
Yet we keep doing it. And one could argue, well, it works because, and then you have youth ministers like Annie Grandell and, a list of other people that we know who have been very successful in ministry, who started on the stage
Hmm.
and maybe grew out of it. But
Yeah.
I'm gaining from what you're saying that that's not exactly the healthiest way of onboarding or recruiting, lay ecclesial ministers. Is that correct?
Right, right. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. And I'm so grateful that they took a chance on me, right? I was a
Mm.
23-year-old with a philosophy degree, for Pete's sake. Um,
You know what? I'll have to, and I'll talk to Stephen, our producer, about this. We'll have to start logging what people's degrees were before they got into ministry. So, yeah,
yes.
Annie, you said philosophy.
Yeah, technically Catholic Studies, which is an interdisciplinary course between philosophy, theology, literature, history, all of the things.
Well, we know ministry will always pay more than philosopher, so there you go. But
So there you
yeah,
go.
there
So
you
that's nice. Um, but so yeah, I'm glad that they took a chance on me. And I did have a lot of zeal and intentionality. I didn't just end up in ministry. It's something that I'd worked toward.
go.
Um, but unfortunately, in parish life, frequently that persona that I laid out, which was myself, is hired and says, "Here's all the teenagers, make them love Jesus." And there's no real mentoring or onboarding or directing, other than checking in about how their numbers are. And so most of those people end up burning out. They're the lovers and the dreamers, right, of this world. And the lovers and dreamers need direction. And I was lucky enough that I had some support in my early days, but that's just frequently not the case.
Well, let's talk about that support. So, what does that look like? Because I know that's a huge part of what you're all doing with YDisciple.
Sure.
I think what like distinguishes you from other organizations is it's not just like here's the curriculum, but there's actual literal training that comes along with that. So, talk a little bit about your not just your formation as a ministry leader, but also the support and the training you got from others.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as a ministry leader, even leading into my first job, I was really lucky to have some great mentors. Some in my home diocese, some in different internships that I had, some locally here, that really helped me understand that youth ministry isn't always being on the stage. That most of your time you're at a computer and you're planning, and having a plan, and having direction and strategy isn't just nice, but necessary. Like the work that we are doing is the most important work. If what we believe is true, it's the most important work. And so we should treat the work as important, including the strategy around it. And I'm a fan of the old adage that says, have a plan from which to diverge, right?
Yeah.
The Holy Spirit should always be involved, but we can't blame the Holy Spirit for a lack of planning.
Right. Right.
So I was really grateful to have people who helped me understand those things early on, and to help me think forward, and be intentional.
What do you think was like the hardest obstacle to overcome in regards to moving to that mindset?
Oh man. I remember I have a very, very vivid memory, of I had an internship in the New Albany Deanery in Southern Indiana, one of my years of college, over a summer. And the task that I had been given that day was to feed postcards about summer ministry events through a stamp machine. Like that's what I mean, I did it for hours and hours and hours. And my young, zealous self was like, what is this doing for the kingdom? Like this is a
Yeah.
waste of
Yeah.
my time. And it was this moment of the Lord saying, like, people need to know so that they can encounter,
Right.
right? We need to communicate so that they can encounter. So feeding those stinking postcards through a machine had a place in building the kingdom. And so understanding those things that we can pass off as just administrative also are important, as part of our work in building the kingdom.
You just affirmed a situation similar that I had where we had one of those folding machines,
Yes,
that folded
those
the
were
booklets.
so cool.
They were cool and they worked, but when they didn't, which was probably 75% of the time, and there was one time where I just couldn't get it to work. And I just remember like being in the copier room and screaming and kicking the machine. Like this is like 3 years in the ministry, and finally being like, I can't effing take it anymore, and just walked out. And finally, like probably a half an hour later, Father White, my pastor at the time, he walked up with a gift card to Starbucks. He's like, I think you just need to take a coffee break today. We'll look at the folding machine for you. And it was just like, I was like, oh, was it that obvious? He's like, you cussed. So, yeah, sometimes that's, I think, where Satan attacks us, right? And we're like,
Yeah.
what does stamping postcards or folding copies have to
Yeah.
do with the kingdom? But, and that's also when we realize we need volunteers and people to
Hmm.
train and people that are part of our team. Sorry, everyone, to interrupt your show. I know it was so good, that cliffhanger and everything. But anyway, I wanted to talk to you about today's sponsor, and that's YDisciple. YDisciple is on a mission to empower the next generation by empowering adult leaders and help you launch small groups and help you grow disciples of the next generation. And today I'm really especially excited to share something from the heart, and that's YDisciple's curriculum seasons for middle school students, right? There's a lot of stuff for high school students, but not enough for middle school students. Anyway, over the past year, I've been working with YDisciple on creating this season's curriculum so that you can help young people understand the liturgical calendar and go on this faith-filled journey through scripture and liturgy. Whether you're an educator, a parent, a mentor, Seasons by YDisciple offers a unique opportunity to illuminate the path of faith for our younger generation. So go and check out YDisciple's website at ydisciple.tv or see the link in the show notes. They've got so much great curriculum, not just seasons, but video-based curriculum that you can use on your confirmation retreats or in your groups, or you can high school curriculum, middle school curriculum, and so much more. Again, training and everything like that. You got to check out YDisciple. It's something we use in our parish as well. So I definitely highly recommend it. So go to ydisciple.tv or click on the show notes before. And now back to the show. And so I want to kind of go back to that. I mentioned a little bit before, like how, one thing YDisciple does, and we've talked about this before, like how training mentors and leaders, especially adults, for mentoring young people, especially, is so key and important. So can you discuss that importance and that framework? How does that look with YDisciple? How does that look at like in the paradigms that you've been a part of?
I mean, I think anybody worth their salt in ministry knows they can't do it alone. That they need a team. For me, the shift was I had recruited an amazing team to help with our youth group. I'm very blessed to live where I was doing ministry reasonably close to a Catholic university, so a good pool of people, and in the same city where NET Ministries is located. So there's a lot of alumni who were missionaries who have ministry experience and formation that I could just like pluck from. And so I had built a really good core team. Most of them were from outside of my parish, though. Okay. And some of them came into the parish and because of the ministry, and they got to know people. But most of them were outsiders that I had recruited in, and they were amazing. Like, there's nothing to say poor about what they did. They were just an incredible team that I got to work with. But what I wasn't doing was reaching out to the people in the pews. I was doing it for the things that I needed them for, like confirmation leaders, but not for doing youth ministry in a really intentional way. It was more, sadly, treating them more like warm bodies. And so I wasn't really empowering the parish. I was creating, again, a ministry circled around my own connections, right? Yeah. And so when we started to shift to a small group discipleship model in our ministry, not singularly, but to put more emphasis on that, I had to get more people than were just on my core team. I had to get people who were in the pews bought in. And I think the important thing was, because of the way we'd been running ministry, like we talked about the stage and the energy, there were a lot of faithful adults who had a heart for teenagers who were uninterested in being a part of that ministry because they were terrified that I was going to make them go on stage, which I did to my core team all the time. So the adults in the parish were like, yeah, that's awesome. I love that you're doing that. I don't want to be a part of it. But a small group was something much more accessible to their minds and to their skill set.
It's interesting you point that out because, right, there is that intimidation. And this goes back to one of the downsides. Again, I agree with you. I don't want to necessarily knock large group programming. No. I think there's definitely fruit in that. But when that's all you have for youth ministry or any kind of ministry, that's all you're showing people of how it's done. And so if you're introverted, if you have stage fright, which, right, isn't that like the number one fear that people have? Like
higher than death.
Yeah, higher than death. Like you're saying, like, all right, yeah, people would literally rather die than do youth ministry because they're seeing youth ministry as being on stage. And so, so you talked about the fear that they might have. What were some of the other fears though you had, even going back to like asking people in the pews versus, going to people in the community that you were familiar with?
One of my fears was, a couple of my fears was, if I'm not recruiting the people that I know have the formation that I trust, again, who is the middle, what kind of heresy are they going to teach? Like you go down these weird paths so easily. Which that's a whole other thing. That's not what this podcast is going to be about. That was one of my fears. My other fear was I've tapped out the people in this community that are willing to work with me. I got the same people saying yes over and over. And it's what is it? Matthew Kelly talks about how it's like 4% of the parish that does all the work.
Right.
And I had my 4% that were willing to work with me. And so I was like, there's nobody else. There's nobody else I could ask. And then I was challenged when I found YDisciple, that instead of the question being like, how am I going to get people to buy into the being a part of our ministry, especially when it came to small groups, is starting to ask the people who are going to be involved in the ministry, the young people and their parents, if you could ask anybody in the parish to be your mentor, who would you ask? And it made that circle much bigger than me, because they were identifying people I never would have thought of who ended up being awesome.
Right. So so you got these recommendations. Did you go up to the people and say like, hey, you were highly recommended by teenagers to be your and like what was their response like?
Okay, so here's the thing. You know this. I know this. Most people who've worked for the church for more than 6 months know this. Church people's emails get deleted. Like when MailChimp first came out and I was able to actually track, because I'm a numbers dork, how many people were opening my emails, I was like, oh, I now have confirmation on the thing I always knew. Nobody reads my emails. They're used to saying no to me. Right. After 10 years, they could ignore my pulpit pitches. They could ignore my bulletin announcements because, 4% of people read the bulletin anyway. Right. So I had limited influence there. But when I approached somebody, again, I'd been in the community long enough. I'm making it sound like everyone hated me. I had really good, strong relationships in that community, and I still do. So I was there long enough that they trusted me, but they just weren't working with our ministry. So when I went up to them and said, hey, Tommy and his friends identified you as somebody that they want to mentor them in the Christian life. Totally different ask. Yeah. You want to know how hard that is to say no to? Me saying, I need a volunteer. Easy to dismiss. Me saying, Tommy asked you to mentor him. Changed the game. I know a youth minister in Ohio who's actually worked hard to not use the word volunteer anymore, because he said it comes with so much baggage of people thinking warm body with a textbook. And also it's the church. They know it's a volunteer gig. It's redundant to say so. And so he only uses the word mentor because that's a higher value ask for the adults themselves.
Yeah, and what's important too is you not only said mentor, but mentor in the Christian faith, right? Which shows not just a desire for them to be a role model, but the qualification of where they might be thinking in their head, like, I'm not qualified to do this, right? Because that's another reason why people turn it down. It's not just busyness, but lack of education or qualification along those lines. So I think that is really, really important. So there's a lot of great advice here, but if parish is starting out youth ministry, if they're looking to revitalize their youth ministry, what's some of the advice that you're giving, whether it's through YDisciple or your own personal experience? If I'm a parish that's like, all right, Annie, we've tried everything, the pandemic ruined us or like set us back, how do we get going again? What are you throwing out there?
Yeah, it's a couple things. First is you're not alone. Everybody is in that situation who works in the parish life. The pandemic hit and it shot down everything that had been going. There's a very, very small percentage of parishes that were able to rebuild after that. It's just not a thing. And I think that's important for people to realize, like, you're not alone. There's not something wrong with you. And in that time, the culture has shifted dramatically. Like youth culture, I think it could even be argued that we can't even talk about youth culture anymore because there's not a youth monoculture anymore. Again, another podcast. Yeah.
Taking these notes down, I'm like, all right, yep, we're gonna bring Annie back or other people to talk about
Love
some
it.
of these things. Yeah, there's so many layers to pull back here, but sorry.
Yes. Yeah. So what was working probably isn't working anymore. But a friend of mine, Jordan Berry, he's the Alpha Youth Director or he's the Director of Alpha Youth for Alpha. He's great.
Much different context there. Alpha Youth versus,
I don't know what I'm saying.
Sorry,
I haven't had enough coffee yet. But he talks about how the upside to the downside of the pandemic was that it shut down all the things that we thought were working that actually weren't. we were doing good enough that it just seemed like, okay, it's all fine. And then it took away our ability to be on stage. It took away our ability to gather these large groups and have put on a big show. And so what was left was relationships.
Yeah.
What was left was personal connection. And people are craving that. So first thing, you're not alone. Second thing is, let's not just go back to doing things the way we've always done them. We've been handed a gift to rethink, to revitalize, to say, okay, what am I going to pass on and what am I going to pass back?
Yeah.
And then the third thing I tell people is start small. When we try to start something big, when we try to start a movement, I don't know a lot of people who tried to start a movement. Often they take a small step.
Okay.
And they plant a mustard seed, right? And it grows from there. When we in ministry say like, okay, I'm going to, my first year of ministry, I'm going to build the giant youth group. All of that energy was coming from me. All of the recruiting was coming from me. All of the like trying to drag kids in, kicking and screaming, was coming from me. By the way, by the end of my first year, I had 12 people on my core team and 6 teenagers.
Nice.
I wish I had known about small group discipleship then, because we would have been great at it.
Well, but that's just a sign that you had good things to come, because I think I've shared this before, where when we separated confirmation from our high school ministry, I was successful at growing our confirmation, our high school ministry, from about 60 kids to 5, and those 5 kids were in our student worship band.
Yeah.
4 of them were, and the 5th one was like the girlfriend of the drummer. And so it was basically like band practice every single week, where I preached to the band. So yeah.
It's so beautiful.
It was beautiful. But like you, I wasn't thinking, oh, this is a small group. I was thinking, I'm a failure.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yep. But like even starting a small group ministry, people are like, okay, I'm going to throw out everything I've ever done and I'm going to do small groups. That is so much effort.
Yeah.
And if you get tired, it's going to fizzle.
Yeah.
Start a small group. Get one group going well. And you can see organic growth.
Should they be doing that like as like a beta test? Like what if you have an existing like once a month XLT or large group gathering or mission work? Should you start the small group like on the side as like something you do during Lent or Advent or something like that? Like what would you suggest?
Yeah, I think the liturgical calendar hands us opportunities to do it all the time, right? Isn't that beautiful? Sometimes, I'll say this, what I used to do is I used to run a giant large group ministry every week, and occasionally Lent, Advent, over the summer, I'd have a group of students that would be like, hey, can we go a little bit deeper here? And so I'd have like a small group that would run intermittently. And then we just flipped that script over. And we had small group happening every week. And then occasionally we'd have big group events to bring everybody together. So yeah, that's what I always recommend.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, and even though it's been an uphill battle coming from the pandemic, I'm sure that you guys have seen plenty of bright spots, right? And I think that's something that, with this podcast, but, also we need to do more in the church is not just talk about the doom and gloom of people are leaving the church and, things aren't the same since the pandemic, but what are some of the bright spots that you're seeing either through your efforts in YDisciple or just the ministry leaders you're talking to throughout the country?
Yeah, I think the bright spots that I see are people who, again, going back to 2020, took that opportunity and instead of wringing their hands, saying, well, I guess I can't do anything, got smart and innovative and got curious and started to ask questions and shift their ministries. One of my favorite examples is a parish in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. They use that opportunity to say like, hey, let's start a couple small groups. Got some great traction with it. They've grown their small group ministry so much that the young people in it actually want to go even deeper. And now they're doing one-on-one mentoring.
Okay.
And that's such an incredible win for me. Yeah. I always like when I think people think I'm just so attached to like the YDisciple product. That people will apologize. They're like, oh, I'm really sorry. Yeah. We're not doing small groups right now. We're doing one-on-one mentoring. I'm like, that's it. That's us winning. Like, great job. You keep doing your job great. So I'm seeing things like that. I'm seeing people rethink confirmation, and how can we approach it with a discipleship mindset, instead of a transactional
Yeah.
mindset.
Yeah.
Let's give them a list.
Last thing we need is
Yeah.
another graduation, right? I mean, like, that's how we treat it, so
Let's come back and do this again, and we'll just talk about confirmation.
we
Um,
will. We will. I'm trying not to bait you into talking about how I need to rewrite my book, but I guess like I did that. It's a shameless plug for myself, but
Absolutely. Well, I was going to shamelessly plug you because I read that book when I was a youth minister, and now I'm on your podcast.
I know. But we have to look to the future, right? So looking ahead,
sure.
and you've talked about a couple of things like mentoring, just the evolution of small groups and everything like that. How do you envision the evolution of youth ministry or just discipleship within the Catholic Church in response to the constantly changing culture and the way that things are just evolving over time?
I'll go back to something I mentioned briefly. Like, I don't think we can say that there's a youth monoculture anymore. It used to be one of my favorite things to do. Anyone listening today, I want you to open up your phone and look up the Billboard Top 100 from the year you graduated high school, and see how many of them you remember. By the way, the older a person is who asks this question, the more songs they actually still remember.
Yeah.
If you ask a teenager today, somebody in Gen Z, to pull up the Spotify top 50, I've never seen a teenager be able to name more than 25% of the songs.
Yeah.
It used to be a couple record labels telling us what we would listen to. And now it's algorithms customizing to each person's preferences, right? It's neutral. I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just information. There isn't a monoculture anymore. It's not like everybody's listening to this. If they are, it's usually somebody from the past. The sound of the summer was Taylor Swift, going over her old stuff.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't something new. Like, you remember the summer of 2003 when Beyonce's Crazy in Love was like, we were so sick of it. Also, that was 20 years ago. How old are we?
Anyway. We're not gonna cross that bridge, but
no, it's fine. And she's still the queen. It's great. But if there is no youth monoculture anymore, we cannot have mono ministries.
Right.
And so the evolution that I see happening is creating a much more customized approach to how we do ministry. And it's why I'm such an advocate of small groups, because it's easier. It's simpler. It's never easy. Ministry with teenagers is never easy. It's simpler to customize for 6 young people than it is for 100.
Well, and to that, I think that also makes parenting, and again, another conversation for another time, difficult, because like, as you're talking, like, man, not only do we have diversity of culture within our ministries, but even in families. Like, my youngest son, Ben, who's going to be 11 soon, he is so into Dungeons and Dragons, The Hobbit, like all this fantasy stuff. I love it.
Yeah.
And my older son, Matthew, he's so into baseball and Madden stuff, and like all that kind of stuff, and I love that too. But they're completely different. I mean, it's just it's amazing, but it is that challenge, and that's why I think smaller groups, mentoring, accompaniment, things along those lines are so key. Hey everyone, I just wanted to take a moment to tell you about the Church Podcast Plus subscription. When you sign up for CP Plus, you get ad-free episodes, early access to those episodes. We'll also send you a free subscription to our Marathon Youth Ministry Premium newsletter, which is filled with videos and articles and so many different things that help you do ministry better. Another thing you get with the Plus is 10% off your next custom t-shirt order from 4 Marks Printing. You don't want to miss that. That'll help you look good and help your ministry look good at the same time. They have so much great swag. You got to definitely check them out. But you get 10% off your first custom order. So you definitely want to take advantage of that. The other thing that's really cool when you sign up for the Church Podcast Plus is you become a producer of a podcast. What's better than being a producer of a podcast? Absolutely nothing. But actually, the really awesome thing about being a C Plus member is 50% of what you pay every single month. So half of that, $6 a month, goes towards supporting ministry research. That's right. 50% of what you give will be a part of our donation to Ministry Training Source, a resource all about helping ministers, helping parishes build up the profession of lay ecclesial ministry. So all you got to do is click on the show notes below or go to the churchpodcast.org to sign up today. You don't want to miss it. And instead of getting that yodeling pickle off of Amazon, sign up for the CP Plus and be an awesome church podcast producer. Anyway, back to the show. Annie, really appreciate this conversation. I know we could continue to talk, but as we kind of wrap things up here, one of the things we do with all of our guests is we go through our final 5 questions, right? So a little bit of a hot seat sort of situation, but I've got 5 questions. I know you took a look at them ahead of time, so but are you ready to tackle them?
Let me get caffeinated first, and now I'm ready.
All right, there we go. All right, so in addition to prayer, right? I hate how we always have to say, in addition to prayer, right? But in addition to prayer, what is one tangible tool or resource that has helped you be your most productive self?
A favorite book of mine, it's called The One Thing. It's by Gary Keller of Keller Williams Realty. But the whole concept of the book is the word priorities is a modern word. For the first several hundred years that word existed, it was a singular thing because you cannot have more than one thing. And the thing he hits over and over in the book is, what is the one thing I can be doing that by doing that one thing makes everything else I do either easier or unnecessary? And you can apply that to your spiritual life. You can apply that to your health. You can apply that to your work. And so in work, I often go back to that. Like, what's the one thing? Because we're talking about the salvation of the world, right? So there's a lot of things, like there's 8 billion. But what's the one thing that I should be doing? Highly recommend that book. It revolutionized how I work.
That's awesome. That's awesome. All right. What are you currently reading, watching, or listening? And it doesn't have to be faith-based or Christian-based. You know, we're giving you permission to even mention something secular. But what are you currently reading, watching, or listening to that you feel like everyone else has to experience?
Oh, man. That everyone has to experience. Is it like to make them better youth ministers or just to be awesome people?
I'm going to let you just interpret it in the way that you see fit.
Just finished season 3 of Only Murders in the Building yesterday.
Okay.
And it's an amazing show. And I think everybody can appreciate something about that show. It doesn't make you better necessarily. It's just fun.
That's good. Yeah, no, my wife loves that show.
Good.
She's been watching that for sure. So, all right, cool. Third question. What is the worst ministry or leadership advice you've ever gotten from someone regarding the work that you do?
Man, there were so many. You gave me this question ahead of time. I was like, how do I narrow it down? I'm going to go controversial on this one. I decided though.
All right.
It's not about the numbers.
Okay.
Because we're Catholics. We believe in a both and, right? The shepherd leaves the 99 for the sake of the one. And we absolutely should be concerned about the individuals. But if it's not about the numbers, then somebody needs to tell St. Luke, because the gospel and the Acts of the Apostles are just filled with numbers. 3,000 were added to their numbers that day. And if we are missionaries, if we are evangelists, we should be hungry for every possible soul. And numbers are neutral, but they tell us something.
Yeah.
And numbers, when I actually started to do the math and look at the numbers in my own ministry, I wasn't satisfied. My big youth group was still only about 15% of the students in my parish. I was hungrier than that. How could I reach more?
Right.
By actually getting smaller and decentralizing. So it's a both and, but saying it's not about the numbers can make us ignore some very real things.
Yeah. No, it's definitely one of those more controversial, those polarizing sort of topics there. And I agree with you. That it's not about the numbers. Can sometimes sidetrack us from measurements and goals, right? So, all right, if you had one message for a new ecclesial minister leader starting out in the field of ministry, what would that be?
You are not your ministry. Your value does not lie in what you do for Jesus. Your value lies in that you're his. That before he called you youth minister, he called you daughter, he called you son. And if we ever lose sight of that, everything falls apart.
Wow. Yeah. I had a diocesan director I know who I asked that question once, and she said, day one, you start replacing yourself. Like day one, you're replacing yourself, not because you want to lose your job or anything, but like it's all about delegation, not building the ministry on yourself. And I think that's huge. And so, yeah, I definitely agree with that. All right. What's your biggest hope for the church at this time?
So, yeah, this is another one that I was like, oh gosh, all the things. I I would say my biggest hope for the church, and it's because I see actual tangible hope for it, is a healthy, theologically appropriate decentralization. And that is, I'm not trying to say anything against our hierarchy, big fan. But the Archbishop of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Archbishop Hebda, has been using that word constantly. He's like, we need to decentralize our ministries because guess what our archdiocese is doing? Small groups in every parish. Yeah. Like that is his dream. And his point is that he wants to empower more people in the pews to be a part of his mission. And so I'm hearing bishops talk about it again in a healthy, theologically appropriate way. And it just gives me hope that there's a space for that in the church.
Well, and you don't want people to get confused with, we're not saying decentralize the liturgy or the mass,
No,
right?
No.
By any means. We're talking more about when you're commissioned, and when you lead and what you're doing throughout the week and everything. And I think that can be a scary word, right? Decentralization, because it's been used so negatively in secular terms and things along those lines. But what we're really talking about is the 2x2 model, right? The small group model, the mentoring model, which I think is so key and so true.
And when Jesus sent them out 2x2, he brought them back to himself. It's not just, hey, go out there. It was always this coming back. It was this constant cycle. And that's what our Archbishop here is talking about. He's inviting us into his mission as a bishop. And it's exciting.
That's awesome. Well, Annie, I know we're going to have just tons of conversations offline and, in other sort of circumstances. And we'll, of course, have to bring you back. There's 1,000 notes that I've been taking of things that we're going to have to talk about. But if people want to find you, if they want to reach out to you or learn more about you, where is a good place we could send them?
Excellent. YDisciple.com will tell you everything you need to know about what YDisciple is, our toolbox to help you do small group discipleship in your context. And if you love middle schoolers, because we all love middle schoolers, they're the best, we have a series that comes out every single week that's written by Chris Wesley right here. And it's based on the lectionary. There's no videos. I love that. So we have stuff to help you do small groups in your context. And we're here to help. So ydisciple.com. Awesome.
Well, and we'll have some of those links in the show notes. And of course, again, Annie, so glad that you could join us on the show. And we'll see you next time.
Great. Thanks again, Chris.
Okay. This has been a production of Marathon Youth Ministry, the church podcast talking all things ministry, produced by Stephen Herrera and Be Well Creative. Music provided by Loco Joseph. No animals were hurt in the production of this podcast. Please be sure to tip your waiters. See you next time.